Hello, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Punske. I am an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics at Southern Illinois University. This video is primarily meant for my students in Intro to Syntactic Theories, but I thought I would make it publicly available because of the ongoing global pandemic that's kind of causing all of us to shift online. And if this video is useful for anyone else out there, great. If it's not, that's fine. But right now we're all sort of just a community trying to deal with this ongoing crisis. And so I thought I would help out in any small way I could. So what I'm going to be doing today is sort of doing a short review of the materials that we covered in the class prior to the spring break and prior to the shift to the online teaching. So in the class we use Carnie's generative syntax introduction as our primary text. There's a few other texts that we use as well, particularly the graduate students. And what I'm going to talk about today it roughly covers the first 6 chapters, though obviously it's going to go fairly quick. So if this is your first exposure to syntax, it's going to move very quickly. But if you're like my class, just reviewing a few pieces of core content, this should be more than sufficient for you. So the first thing we want to think about is, what is syntax? And there's a number of different, ways of thinking about syntax and grammatical models and these types of things. And the model that we are building in this class is fundamentally a model of knowledge. And it's also a model centered around the sentence. And these are both things that I think we need to unpack in different ways. First, what does it mean to be a model of knowledge? Well, I think this is something that frequently trips people up when they think about syntax and when they think about syntactic theory. Because, we use language when we're speaking, when we're listening. So we use language in a production and processing way. And so we want our model of syntax to maybe interact directly with those modalities. But that's not the model that we're building. We're building a model that may interact with those modalities, but it does not necessarily have to. Our main goal is to understand the ways in which a speaker knows the language that they speak, but it's not necessary that they're always accessing that, if that makes sense. You can almost think about this in a Platonic sense, if you're familiar with Platonistic philosophy. You don't have to. We can leave aside what it means to be a model of knowledge, maybe to philosophy of science and so forth, but it is an important note to keep in mind. One other note is these videos are not going to be professional. There is my dog who loves to bark. There's also going to be a cat roaming around here. Most of my examples are going to be done on a chalkboard. This is done with quick turnaround just to try to get content online so we can make it through this crisis together. So it is what it is, and I just hope we can do some syntax together. Getting back to the other point, which is that it centers around the sentence. This is, again, something that we could... this is an assumption we're making. I think it's a well-founded assumption based on the discoveries we've made and so forth. But, other views of language may hold that it's the discourse or it's the conversation that actually are primary. So, and this is part of scientific discovery. We do have to make certain assumptions to make advancements. And every now and then we do want to step back and say, are those assumptions well-founded? So, this is something just to hold in our hat and say, maybe at the end of the course or even down the road and say, are we right in these assumptions? So what is the primary goal of syntax? Well, we know that, when we take a sentence, that the individual units contribute to the meaning of a sentence, but also those individual units contribute more than just the sum of their parts. So if I say something like, the boy hit a rock, that means something different than a rock hit the boy. So there's something meaningful about the ways in which the sentence is organized. And that this organization has sort of kind of fundamental ways in which it sort of plays out in other means also within the syntax. So like I have an example here, that when we form a question, that the linear order just doesn't, isn't the only thing that matters. So first time I'm trying to use this with this camera. Ooh, yes. So if I say the student who can leave early may eat peanuts, and I want to form a question out of this. Well, we know that questions in English, yes/no questions, for instance, that one of the ways, the primary way we form a yes/no question in English is we grab an auxiliary verb, the first auxiliary, and we move it to the front of the sentence. Well, if English only cared about linear order, we would predict that the sentence would be, can the student leave early may eat peanuts? But that, of course, is gibberish. That's not how we produce this sentence in English. Instead, the sentence is produced, may the student, may the student who can leave early eat peanuts. Because what we need to do here is pay attention to the fact that who can leave early is part of a larger constituent, the subject, and that may is really that highest auxiliary. So we need to have a more nuanced view of constituency, a more nuanced view of sort of order, and that leads us to something like hierarchical structures. And in the class, the first thing we did was we built hierarchical structures through our phrase structure grammars. And we said, okay, we can establish these types of orders through phrase structure grammars. So we would take something like a noun phrase, and we would say, okay, well, noun phrases can have different types of words and phrases within them, and we would sort of play out what they could have. We could say, well, a noun phrase can have an optional determiner like the, any number of optional adjective phrases. It must have a noun, can be followed by optional prepositional phrases, and followed by an optional complementizer phrase. So something like this. And am I getting it on the video? There we go. And this works pretty well for our theory of, well, I'm cutting off part of it. There we go. This works pretty well. It works well enough as a sort of descriptive grammar of a lot of the things that we encounter. So we can capture most of the sort of predicted orders of words that we find in the grammatical system of English and other languages. But there are a few issues that start to arise with our sort of the grammatical predictions that the phrase structure grammar makes. In particular, one of the things that we said about a phrase structure grammar, or about a tree structure, is that the tree structure, each node on a tree represents a constituent. And one of the things we noticed is that we can have sentences like the brown-haired student of linguistics and the red-haired one left. And that one replacement, which is one of our constituency tests, okay, can I get it? Doo-doo-doo. Oh, Lord. All right, try backing that up. Backing myself up. Yeah, there we go. One of our constituency tests says that if we can replace something with a proform or like something like one, that it must be a constituent. And so what we're targeting here is student of linguistics. And for many speakers, we can't say something like the brown-haired student of linguistics and the red-haired one of physics left. Now, some speakers can say that. There's considerable speaker variation in this. But it goes to show that our approach to constituency wasn't nuanced enough, because there's no way in that phrase structure grammar of our noun phrases that we could account for this sort of this variation. So that was one problem. Another problem with our phrase structure grammars was they really weren't restricted in any way. Now, there are ways we could build in some restrictions, but I could, in principle, write a rule that says a noun phrase contains a verb, a tense, a conjunction, and a preposition. All mandatory. Now, that's a very linguistically implausible rule, but there's nothing in the theory that prevents me from doing so. So it's not likely to happen, but it is something that is permissible within our theory. So as we move and as we think about what it means to be a good scientific theory, the phrase structure grammars start to look a little suspect there. So we started to think, well, maybe there's something better out there. So one of the things we looked at was, what if we add intermediate levels to our structures? What if we added something to account for this, the one replacement test that we saw? I have no idea if you can see this, because I can't see my own camera. So what we introduced was something called Xbar Theory. And Xbar Theory solves both of these problems in different ways. It adds intermediate levels, which adds an intermediate layer of constituency. But it also provides a more fundamental constraint on the way rules are formed. Because now we're required to maintain a level of phrasal consistency in our rules. And I'll show this in a second. So the core idea of Xbar theory is that we can account for the entire tree, not with lexically specified rules like we had with our phrase structure grammars, where the noun phrase has these rules, the verb phrase has these rules, the complementizer phrase has these rules, the TP has these rules, and so forth and so forth and so forth. But rather, there are 3 rules. Well, maybe 6, because there are ors potentially within these, but there are just generalized rules that apply across the tree. And that no matter what type of lexical head you are, this structure will apply to you. And that the head will project its phrase up. So the core idea here is that we have our 3 basic rules. So we have our 3 basic rules, and we'll start up here. We'll start at the top, which is also known as our specifier rule. And our specifier rule says that you have a maximal projection, an XP. And the XP can go to either a optional ZP, which is a variable phrase, so just another phrase, followed by an Xbar. And this Xbar is, again, an intermediate projection. But this is a required stage of Xbar theory. The next stage is the Xbar stage, which says that you go from Xbar again to another optional WP, which is another phrasal projection, a variable phrasal projection. So this could be any type of phrase, and project to another Xbar. And this is one of the things that allows us to get our recursion within our system. And then the final stage is where we get our head. But really, if we build from the bottom up, actually, this should not be an Xbar. Whoops, whoopsies. So Xbar goes to an X followed by a YP. But what's critical here is that this is these 3 different rules give us 3 different types of constituents. This rule gives us a head followed by a complement, or a complement followed by its head, depending on the language. This one gives us what are known as our adjuncts, and this one gives us our specifier. So we refer to this one as the specifier rule, the adjunct rule, and the complement rule. And different languages, this is can be a source of cross-linguistic variation. So different languages can vary in terms of how they which of these rules they utilize. So a language like English is going to utilize this version of the complement rule, both versions of the adjunct rule, and this version of the specifier rule. Though we haven't really gotten into the specifier rule too much yet. but we'll see it coming up in the next few classes. So for many speakers, things like one replacement must target an Xbar. So in my dialect, for instance, you can only target one replacement at the Xbar level. For other speakers, you can target one replacement at an X0 level, a head level, and that explains that variation that we saw earlier. But so these are the rules. And again, what's critical about these rules, in contrast to our phrase structure grammar rules, is that this X is the same X throughout. So if this is a noun phrase, it is going to require that the noun project, the N project all the way through up to the NP, which was not necessarily a requirement of our phrase structure grammars. So this is a really nice addition to our Xbar that Xbar gives us. The other nice thing that this provides us is that it can give us the ability to capture that intermediate constituency that we couldn't before. So these are two big advantages that we get through Xbar theory. So before we move on, I want to briefly talk about binding theory. I want to just point out that we still have some residues of the old system that we need to deal with, and that's what we'll start to deal with in our next video. But a number of our rules still don't quite match up to the promise of Xbar theory. In particular, what are we doing with specifiers? When we look at our a VP structure, the VP is just empty. The VP specifier is just empty. The only specifier we've really seen so far is in a noun phrase. So if I draw up a noun phrase here, say the student of linguistics. So here's our tree structure here. And some of the things we can notice about this tree structure is we do have a specifier, but it still doesn't obey our specifier rule. In particular, this is not a phrase. That is just a lexical head showing up inside the specifier position. And that doesn't seem right. So it's kind of weird that we spent all this time building this Xbar theory to get to something that doesn't quite have all the components there yet. But we're gonna fix that. So that's something to keep in mind. But that is a problem. So we will be working on that. All right, the last thing I want to talk about today is binding theory. So binding theory also provides us another really nice piece of evidence for constituency. So there are three pieces of binding. These are known as are either principle or condition A, B, and C. And really, I'm going to focus on principles A and B. There's some folks who think that condition C may not really be a syntactic condition, but rather a sort of discourse or generalized condition. But it's still worth knowing, and that's a sort of another topic. But I want to go through each of these. We're going to need to talk a little bit about what some of the core pieces of each of these to really unpack them. So I'm going to write, again, the definitions up here, and then we'll unpack them. Okay, so I want to start off with principle A. And I need to figure out something better than this chalkboard. I don't know what that's going to be. Maybe 2 chalkboards. Anyway, principle A, an anaphor must be bound in its domain. So we need to unpack what those things mean. What does it mean for an first, what is an anaphor? What does it mean for something to be bound? And what is a domain? So, an anaphor, for our purposes right now, we're going to include also expressions like reciprocals. But anaphors are things that generally end in self. So his self, her self, their selves. And we're also going to include things like each other. So John and Bill kissed each other. The other thing, so what does it mean for them to be, for these things to be bound? Well, for something to be bound, we need to pay attention to 2 different elements. Something is bound when it is co-indexed and when it is C-commanded. If either piece of that definition fails, you are not bound. So we need to define what both of those are, and then we can also look at what a domain is. So coindexation is really easy to look at. Coindexation is basically a little tag that says, I am the same as this other thing. We use these primarily when we're looking at things like pronouns and anaphors, though they can also be used in other contexts. So if I say, John's father loves himself. Well, this is meaningful under a reading where John is not co-indexed with himself, but father is. And we can see why in a little bit here, but so, and the way that we note these is generally with these little coindexation tags, which start with lowercase subscript letters starting with I. Why we start with lowercase subscript letters starting with I is a little bit beyond me. Seems to be to maximize confusion because J. Anyway, so in this example, father and himself are co-indexed with each other because they share the same tag. Then the next question is, well, do they C-command each other? Well, what is C-command? C command is a structural relation. And a structural relation is it pays attention to the tree structure. It pays attention to the hierarchical relations within a tree. And it has a very particular relationship. I'm going to do this in an abstract tree. So if we have a tree like this, there we go. What we want to pay attention to here is the relations between basically aunts and sisters. So C command is basically a relation between a sister and all of that sister's daughters. So in our example here, ooh, I can scoot back more. Can I stand up? There. In our example here, I don't know if this will be too blurry. B is going to C command C and all of C's daughters. C will also C command B and all of B's daughters. So we define it in terms of basically being sisters, and then if it's C command is basically everything that you're a sister to, and then everything that your sisters that your sister is a mother or grandmother or so forth of. Everything that your sister dominates. That's C command. C command also comes in symmetric and asymmetric forms. So B and C symmetrically C command each other because they both C command each other. Where B asymmetrically C commands H because B C commands H, but H does not C command B. So moving back to binding theory, I'm going to do just a basic phrase structure grammar tree here. I'm going to try to draw this upside down. That's an M. All right. It'll be faster if I do it this way. So we can look at a tree like John loves himself, and what we can see here is that, again, sort of looking at the C command relationships, the NP, which is going to be tagged because the NP John, so that's going to be the thing that is co-indexed here with himself, and this NP C commands this NP because it is a sister to this VP, and therefore C commands this NP containing himself. And so it will be, in this condition, himself is bound because it is C commanded and it is co-indexed. If we change the tag, made that a J, so this would try to be meaning something like John loves some other individual, John loves Bill, this sentence would be ungrammatical because the conditions would not be met. Himself is not bound because it's failing to meet one of those conditions. It is not co-indexed. The next thing we want to talk about is what does it mean to be within a domain? And the easiest way to think about that is within English, what seems to be our domains are complementizer phrases, CPs. So if I take the sentence, John said Mary loves himself, that sentence becomes ungrammatical provided that we're trying to get a co-indexation between John and himself. John still co-indexes himself. And I can show you again in a tree. I'm just going to use the basic phrase structure grammar tree, largely because my chalkboard's pretty small. Okay, so here again, we have a tree, and we can see John is in a co-indexes himself, and also C commands it because it again is a sister of the VP, and that VP still dominates that NP. But the critical difference here is that this CP constitutes a domain. And that's going to violate our principle A constraint because himself must be bound within its domain. So that's principle A. Principle B is, in a lot of ways, the reverse of principle A, and it deals with pronouns. Principle B says, a pronoun must be free in its domain. And what does it mean to be free? Well, to be free means you're not bound. And to be not bound means you must either be not co-indexed or not C-commanded or both. So that's what it means to be free. So either not co-indexed, not C-commanded, or both. So that's why you can get pronouns in sort of these like sentence first contexts where they refer to sort of discourse marked elements. Or other contexts, as long as they are not co-indexed and C-commanded within the same CP, they're allowed. So they're basically just the reverse of anaphors in a lot of ways. Not exactly, but in a lot of ways. So if I say John loves him, that must refer to an individual other than John. But if I say John said Mary loves him, that then can refer back to John because it's outside of the domain. And that's sort of the core elements of principles A and principles B. one handy tip I use to help remind students. So principle A is pretty easy. If you think A for anaphors, unfortunately we don't have that same trick for pronouns. So I say principle B for pronouns. Kind of works. The final one is principle C. And again, principle C is probably the least used of the three principles. But it's also the easiest to remember. So principle C deals with what are known as R expressions. And R expressions are basically everything that is not an anaphor or a pronoun. They're nouns. R expressions, the R in R expression stands for referring. They are things that refer to other things. They are things that have their own inherent reference. So anaphors and pronouns, they get their reference from something else in the linguistic system. R expressions don't. R expressions get their reference. We'll let the philosophers deal with where R expressions get their reference. But they get their reference somewhere, maybe from the world, from Plato, from something. But they get reference elsewhere. And the basic idea of principle C R expressions must be free. This one does not care about domains. It does not care about anything else. It's just, if you are a referring expression, you cannot be bound in any context. You cannot co-refer. You cannot be co-indexed, and you cannot be C-commanded in any context. So that is the core idea of principle C. We're not going to see a lot of principle C. The core ideas of principle C are, I really think they're more discourse related than syntax related. But principles A and principle B are really part of our core syntax. So yeah, we're going to, in the next video, we're going to move on to extending our Xbar theory, dealing with those problematic expressions, the fact that we don't have specifiers, even though we have a specifier rule. Really, the only specifier we have is that that lexical head, that D. What's going on there, and we're going to utilize our principle as A and principles B to try to account for some of these challenges. So I hope this was useful. I'm still figuring out a lot of this stuff, and I'm gonna keep working on it. Try to figure out something better to do with this board, but I will keep working. And hope to see you next time. All right, thank you.